Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first ever ISSA UK Annual General Meeting and conference that is being virtually streamed online as well as being recorded. We actually have for lack of a better term, a live studio audience in the room, as the AGM portion of the meeting has already continued, and now we are looking to promote the wisdom of our speakers wider than our traditional format used to provide. And it is an absolute first for us. So I'm absolutely hoping this is working and you're hearing me. So, thank you. Before we kicked off into sort of the usual ISSA AGM and conference presentation, I did want to just take a second to think about where we have come this year and as a community, because it is, after all, it's been quite a year and quite a change in both information security and in the ISSA community. I talked a little bit about that in the AGM just now, but I just wanted to say that we are entering a sea change, I think, for both information and cybersecurity. This is something we already knew, but also it's a sea change in how security is viewed globally. And when you take that and you take a systemic shift in how society works as a whole, and where we're looking at possible changes in the urban landscape, changes in how communities and offices work, the role of the security evangelist in getting security built in and baked into everything we do is only ever going to increase in this. But it also means that there's a lot more that we need to look at in sort of reaching and engaging out to our colleagues and to our peers who didn't necessarily grow up tracing one end of a packet down the other end of a wire. So it's really, I think, from a community level, all the changes we can hopefully grab onto and sort of promote ISSA throughout the UK, throughout England, and reach out and try to get a few more of the small and medium businesses and others who need to know a little bit more about what we do engaged, because I think there are going to be some open ears. But I'm waxing a bit poetic, and I have been talking for about 2 hours getting all of this set up. So, and thank you. I hope this is all working and you can hear. So the agenda today, as we've heard, we're running a bit behind schedule due to technical difficulties. We'll adjust, James, no worries on that. We've just held our private members only annual general meeting. That has concluded. As always, you can only attend that as a member, and that is not something we will stream or release. And now we are in the main portion of the agenda, my opening. Next up, we have James Chappell from Digital Shadows. I realized I've never once asked how to pronounce your last name, James, so I sincerely hope that I'm getting it right. And we'll be doing some moderated Q&A. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can do Q&A in this case. And so you can post on our YouTube stream if you wish. You can post on Slido. We'll share that in a second. And or you can post in chat here. The one thing I want to caution in is if you unmute yourself and speak out, you could show up on stream, so don't. And that's actually the worthwhile point. This is a first for streaming, logistics and privacy. We are streaming this on YouTube right now. My voice is going out there. If you were to speak, yours isn't right now. And we will try to mute you before the presentation so you can ask, but just please be careful, mindful of your own privacy. And as always, all of our internal chat and the networking sessions are private. So easiest way to ask a question is to go to slido.com and punch in that particular code there. We'll share the full link again after James talks, but I've run over because of technical difficulties, and I want to hand over to James. Let me make sure you're a co-host. Excellent. There may be a little bit of background noise due to a jury-rig mic I just had to set up, but we should be good to go, James. I am going to transition into the slide, and we'll be live on stream ready.
Okay.
Right, we're streaming. So I'm happy here to welcome James Chappell from Digital Shadows, and over to you, James.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abe. Hello, everyone. I'm James Chappell or Chappell. I don't mind. I'm good with either of those. And I'm very fortunate to have worked at Digital Shadows now for coming on for 10 years. I worked in information security for since about 1997. So it's been an interesting journey. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a much debated area in cybersecurity or information security, that of passwords and how they're being used. And in particular, something I'm quite interested in is the way that passwords appear on the internet. Just to give you a little bit of background, over the next 30 minutes, I'll tell you a little bit more about me and why I care about this in a minute. But I'm going to spend the majority of today sharing some research with you I've been conducting over the last couple of years. I'm very pleased to say that I've got the help of some colleagues on this. So I'm hoping I've been boning up on all of our research here. Hopefully I've got all ready to answer your questions as we go through. But I'll if you have questions, there is a Slido at the end. So please save up your questions. I look forward to answering those at the end. So why I care about this is 10 years ago, I became very interested in the topics of open source intelligence, the concept of a digital footprint and what that means for information security. And it sort of led me on a path with my good friend Alistair to set up a company called Digital Shadows. And the reason I find this really fascinating is, we in information security have talked about things like deperimeterization quite a bit, the diminishing role that the perimeter has in modern organizations. Still very important, but it has a different role from what it had, say, 10 years ago. And I think a big part of the way that's changed is the way that information now flows online in a completely different way from what it did, say, 10 years ago. And in particular, what I'm really interested in is digital footprints, for the most part, for organizations are a good thing. It helps them engage with customers. It helps them to do business. It's really a positive thing. But there's some information that's shared on the internet that's relevant to the risks of an organization. And today I'm going to focus on the topic of credentials. I know some of you here will already be doing things like be involved in testing the security of organizations, perhaps through pen testing or red teaming. So some of this, I'm sure, will be familiar to some of the members. But I'll share everything that we've covered and try and hit the level right, given that you've all touched on this a fair amount already. So I'll start off by defining account takeover and trying to set up a shared definition of that. I'll talk about acquisition techniques for credentials online. We'll explore some of the commonly seen toolkits that we see online, and then we'll talk a little bit about the impact on organizations. I'm also going to touch on you some of how we approach this, not as marketing at all, but more as just a sense of some of the things that organizations can do. There are of course, plenty of free things you can do in this area as well. So it's not my intent but I think if we can talk about some of the approaches we take, it's sometimes interesting too. So with that in mind, let's talk about a common definition of account takeover. So a lot of people have a lot of different definitions for account takeover. For me, it's about the process of gaining access to a victim's account, often by compromising it or reusing some sort of login credential. And the objective is literally to take over that account. So account takeover, it's about taking over accounts. Who knew? But the processes that are used for this actually vary a fair amount. And there's lots of different techniques that people use to do it. And it's worth sort of thinking about those in different stages. One report I'm particularly fond of is the annual data breach investigations report produced by Verizon. I've always loved this because it's an empirical report. It actually uses real data to come up with its findings. And in the DBIR, one of the things that's observed is that where a breach relates to a unauthorized access or a hack in that sense, 80% of those involve some kind of brute force cracking or the use or loss of lost or stolen credentials. So if you're familiar with the Verizon report, there's a reporting standard. They take actual breach events and they look at that for using real evidence of real breaches that have happened. So I think that's quite telling. That's a lot of breaches that have some level of credential involved in them. So where do all these credentials come from? Well, I think it's quite interesting to see how aggregating credentials together have become quite in vogue, not just in terms of researchers, but also those seeking to gain access, but also companies like the one that I work at, who are sort of thinking about how to defend and protect organisations. And you probably think of some really great work by people like Troy Hunt, for example, who's run an excellent website for some time, Have I Been Pwned? Who gets submissions from people who detect breaches and shares those around. We too, and some others have been collecting these together. It's always interesting to compare numbers. Numbers never stand still, and they also have lots of different meanings. But so right now, something like 15.5 billion credential pairs that we've seen sort of circulated. Now, that's 15 billion is obviously quite a lot more than there are people on the surface of the planet. So if you think about the 4.5 billion people on the planet, it's actually only really something like 3.5 billion that even have access to the internet. So how come those numbers are so different? And I think the answer is that breaches are becoming sort of so routine that there is now most of us who, I think there's something like an average of 191 services that every human being on Earth, it's a typical number of services that a typical user of the internet will use. That's 191 credentials associated with each person. It just takes 2 or 3 of those sites to become breached, and you start to multiply up the number of available sites quite astronomically. In addition to that, quite a lot of those credentials are either repeated or they're reshared between different resources. So whilst 15 billion sounds like a really terrible number, actually it's around about 6 billion or so of those are actually unique. So it's not quite as horrific as it might sound, but nonetheless, something worth us being aware of as information security practitioners. So how do those with less good intent try and acquire this kind of data? Well, there's sort of really 3 ways. You either beg for them, you borrow them, or you steal them. And there's a few common ways that we see. So probably the most direct one is actually getting them directly from the victims themselves. So through either phishing or some sort of exploit or malware. Keyloggers are obviously quite common. So actually going out there and acquiring them on a per target basis it's a lot of work, but it does get you very fresh, usable credentials for an attack. Similarly, you can purchase credentials on marketplaces. So you can see sort of an advert on the right-hand side here, sort of different username and passwords for sale and a sample set being offered on a particular forum on the right-hand side here. You can also rent an account. So you can actually go and rent a service which will you point it at the victim, and you can actually use an already set up set of credentials for a particular attack. And then there's lots of freebies on places like Pastebin and others, where there's lots of username and password combinations just freely shared every single day of the week. So yeah, you can literally beg, you can borrow it, and they are stolen. If you look at sort of accounts for sale, well, there are a lot of websites selling these, and it's quite interesting looking at the average cost of these. So we were looking in our survey about the average cost of an account for sale. Averages out about $15 for fresh accounts, things that aren't too stale. Interestingly, things like bank accounts attract the highest amounts. You can see on the left-hand side there, sort of something like a typical consumer banking account being sold for $90 there. And you get things like sort of, free access to video streaming services there on the right-hand side for just a few dollars. So, it really does vary quite a way. And things like domain admin, we'll see in a minute, are a sort of very different proposition when that's sold on. If you look at sort of the types of organizations that are attacked here, it's quite interesting. Banking, financial, top the list. It's, I guess, no surprise that those that are exploiting or doing unlawful acts on the internet might target places where the money is. It's obviously an attractive place to go. And luckily, a lot of banks and financial institutions introduce an additional factor, which makes that tougher. So they have to usually employ that with some other technique to get in. But we see a lot on streaming, by far the most popular area. And I know streaming companies spend a lot of time defending against this as well. Proxy VPN services, very popular for obviously other reasons as well. I see a lot of those being traded. Things like cable channels, education, adult services, etc. It sort of bottoms out across the other ones. But yeah, definitely where the money is where it's focused, that's for sure. And it's quite interesting sort of looking at the different costs. So as I say, banks, definitely the highest cost ones. Antivirus, interestingly, because it's sort of a stage in another attack, gaining access to antivirus source code is absolutely a goal, especially for those developing exploits. So those tend to attract a slightly higher price if it's intrusions, certainly more on here. But this particular one's about antivirus software. So, people getting bored with being nagged by their antivirus software. Where can I get a username and password for a valid account so I can stop that nag from occurring? So that's really what that one's all about. And then, as you can see, it sort of drops off across the other areas. In terms of accounts for sale, we do see these are the sorts of things that, as a defender of a network, that you really don't want to be seeing in relation to your organisation. You can see here on the top left hand, so someone that has a domain admin on a target is generally very attractive. This particular one's been sold for $700. The maximum I've seen this particular type of sale being offered for is $120,000 with a detailed instructions on how it could be used in a ransom campaign against that target. So it's really interesting to see just how much money people are willing to exchange. We can sometimes see the money being exchanged here, and you can also judge the credibility of that. So there's a lot of stuff that happens on these forums that isn't credible at all, but we do see these transactions taking place, and the people selling them to be quite credible. And if you look in the news recently, there's Actors Life FX SMP. I think that's an example of someone who's recently indicted in the United States on exactly these charges, and you actually see just how important account access was to them in conducting their work. So you can see sort of people sell access. They don't even mention that it's credentials. It's actually the access to the corporation that matters. And you certainly see a lot of this being offered on forums. So this is all about sort of acquiring them so you can then use them in the next stage. The other thing we see a lot of are brute forcing tools. So these are bits of software that target a login page, and then you can sort of try different passwords out as you go through. And again, we see things that are specifically written for certain websites. So something like a bank and financial services obviously deploy a lot of really good sort of techniques to try and filter out attempts to do this. So they tend to get a higher price. And then you see multi-pack is usually actually a range of different targets. So things that we think might be popular. Cryptocurrency is obviously hard. Again, where is the money? Cryptocurrency is definitely targeted. And then you see social, technology, education, and so on, following on from there. This particular site, sort of Genesis, is quite an interesting one. And it basically is a rental system. So you can rent bots that will go and attempt to brute force into particular accounts. What really, so the fingerprint icon on the Genesis icon there is very significant in this case. Banks quite rightly are doing the right things to try and stop account takeovers from taking place. So one of the things that some of these services do is they're trying to create a fingerprint of a valid user. So create the behaviors, create the sort of features of a valid user that might be associated with the account credential that's being used. And they put quite a bit of effort into doing that and have some idea of the success rates of doing so. So interestingly, you can see that not only have they acquired a username and a password, but they've also acquired associated metadata with that login credential, so that they know that either the location, the browser type, things like where possible, they will spoof, if it is possible to do it in that particular login, they'll try and spoof the IP address of the original user to try and make it look as convincing as possible and maximize the chances of gaining access to the target. So if we look at if we look at these fingerprinting services, we see sort of lots of different services, but Genesis at the moment is probably the number one, and we see others with organisation tools such as Tenebris and Underworld Market as well between January and June. So you can see Genesis currently the lead in that area. If we take a look at the attackers toolkit, there's having acquired credentials or attempts to brute force. There's other types of things as well. So obviously we talked a little bit about brute forces, but there's also things that check accounts. We see credential stuffing tools as things that are used very frequently, and in particular one called Sentry MBA. But we also see tools such as OpenBullet, which was actually a tool started for use by security testers, but unfortunately has fallen into dual use and is now used quite extensively by those looking to break into services too. Some of the sort of reuse tools that we're seeing out there are things like Private Keeper, Vertex, CountHuman, and BlackBullet. These are tools that are looking to take a username and password that's maybe be shared on one of those lists and then try it on lots of different sites to see which site that credential is valid in. And I think a lot of use of these is used for the process of pivoting. So we see attackers taking these these lists of passwords, finding out which ones are valid on different services, be they emails are really a good one because you can pivot to lots of other places from an email account, or equally social media, or indeed streaming. And a big part of this, unfortunately, we as information security practitioners are now well into the concepts of using different passwords in different places, and having decent sort of password hygiene and using two-factor authentication or a second factor wherever it's possible to do so. Unfortunately, we still live in a world where organizations' profits are determined by how difficult that login process is, and sometimes those commercial decisions drive organizations away from putting in place things like second factors that prevent these things from being effective. So we still, unfortunately, here in 2020, who would have thought it, we're still in this place where account reuse is still a big problem for any consumer on the internet. And we, as when we're working in our jobs in companies, we've got to consider that that's still the mindset that sometimes is brought into the business. And we're still working on single sign-on solutions, trying to find easy ways to help consumers to get over these problems. In Credential, in the sort of brute forcing, again, we see a lot of brute forcing by different industries. Multipack is the one that covers lots of different types of sites, and that's by far the most popular one. We also see targeting of banking and financials, and then sort of technology is the next one, and cryptocurrency. Interestingly, after that, I would have thought cryptocurrency would be beyond, but nope. Access to technology is definitely more appreciated here. If we look at sort of the dimensions of various credential stuffing tools in 2020, the big one used to be one called Sentry MBA. That was the one that was used everywhere. But OpenBullet has really become really very, very popular in a very short space of time. It's the new kid on the block as far as stuffing tools goes, and we see it everywhere we look now. So as you can see, it's taken over Sentry MBA by a long, long way. So organisations clearly need to care about this. As I was saying, there's 15 billion exposed credentials. I should extend my little finger and go 15 billion when I say that. As I say, it's always interesting to look at big numbers like that, but it's always worth considering that there is repeats of credentials in there, and there's also the age of those matter. It doesn't mean that they're all valid by any means, and checking them is a really important thing to do too. So looking at sort of the sort of average credentials per organisation, it's really interesting to see if for every employee, seeing which industries sort of show up the most. Weirdly, food and beverage per employee has the most compromised credentials per employee, which is kind of weird. Education, you might expect some of that just because you see a lot of people sort of, young minds are malleable, and they definitely are quite innovative sometimes. And you see that. Technology, I guess, is primarily because the value of software is often locked up in an account, and therefore it's an attractive commodity. Financial services, interestingly, are tough to break into, and obviously just having a credential pair is only half the story. If you're trying to get into a bank account, there's plenty more things that an attacker has to do, so therefore it does get less. But then we see sort of really quite a broad range of organisations after that, be it conglomerates, automobile manufacturers, is sort of tailing off there after that as well. So it is interesting to see. It's not necessarily, the food and beverage is the place we see the most elite credentials, weirdly, but yeah, there it is. It's quite interesting looking at where we see types of password hashes that we see. So it's quite interesting when we talk about a credential. It's not always the case that they're plain text. So we exclude, if we get rid of the ones that are stored in plain text. These are the ones that we see here. MD5 being the most popular, SHA-1, PBK DF2, bcrypt, which is probably the one I'd be picking to protect my passwords these days, as long as it's the right configuration, SHA-256, and then PHP-BB3. And it's sort of quite interesting to see a lot of MD5s out there still. And if you look at the types of organisations that are covered in those, again, it sort of splits up across a really broad range of account types. Now, on the right-hand side here, what we've been able to do is look at the name of the user ID in the account, and it tells you something about what that account is used for. This is really fascinating because, a lot of people have an email address, say invoices@digitalshadows.com. That's not our address, but just imagine it was. It's a very common thing to have a sort of a shared inbox or a shared account. We see a lot of those types of account being shared in passwords. There's a lot of these sort of shared email addresses or shared services appearing in those credential lists. The size of the box there relates to proportionally how many of those accounts types there are across the things that we monitor. So by far, invoice accounts are the number one thing that we see there. But partner accounts, payments, payment, support, vendors, and then scarily admin is still a popular area, and then billing at the end. So really interesting to see the type of accounts that share IDs in that way. So I've got when you're thinking about defending an organization around this, there's a few different things that are worth thinking through. I'm just going to share some of the things that we do. There are other services out there that do this. I'm sure many of you as information security practitioners are already subscribers to websites such as Have I Been Pwned? So you are getting credentials about accounts that you own. All services that run in this area are different. They all have slightly different acquisition methods. I really love Troy's service. He has a great fan base, and he has people sort of approaching him with breaches. There's also, Troy also does less on the sort of discovery and search side. So I guess that's more of what we do. But there are others that have different techniques too. So whatever choice you make around maintaining and managing credentials, it's worth looking around and sort of evaluating what's the best fit for your organization. One of the things we do, so we have a technology called Searchlight that's looking for this stuff. One of the things we do is we're looking at, when that credential was found, so its freshness. We're looking at where it was found, so the context there is really important. Whether or not, if it's a MD5 hash, you're probably going to be versus a bcrypt hash versus a plain text password. You're going to treat that with a different level of risk. If it's the first time you've seen it, you've not seen it anywhere else, you're probably again going to treat it with a different level of risk as well. So it's really important that context when you look at a credential is really valuable and really worth looking at. Also looking at where it was found, so actually finding where on the internet it showed up is quite helpful. Not just looking at that particular breach, that particular credential, but looking at the other credentials found in the breach is quite helpful too. And it helps you sort of gauge how easy it is to mitigate this. Interestingly, I think this is a problem we all have to deal with. We're all sort of trying to wade through a soup of data every day of our working careers, and trying to minimize the amount of data you have to wade through is really important. And in credentials, one of the things that you can do is look for patterns that help you sort of filter out the noise. So one of the patterns you can apply is looking at things like the email address format. So if I know all of my email address formats are first name dot last name at domain.com or domain.org, then I can filter based on the formats. And I know anything that doesn't fit that format, I can safely ignore if I genuinely do know that format is the only one that's followed, or if I've got a couple of formats, I can follow those too. Similarly, you can do the same with passwords. So you have password policies. So in password policies, you've got things about the number of repeated characters, the uppercase, lowercase, etc. Again, if you find a password and it doesn't fit that policy, then you know it's not a problem for you. It might be a problem for the consumer. And some of the folks that I get to work with tell their employee, hey, your work account's safe, but actually you might want to take a look at what's going on your personal accounts. Up to you, but just let you know we found this for you. So we're also seeing more people sort of automate this stuff more generally. So there's sort of ways of sort of triaging this and making it useful. One of the really interesting things we've been doing recently is looking at single sign-on services and integration with things like Okta. So when we find the credential, the customer can look it up immediately and say, is this a valid account or is it not? And at that point, either accept or reject it. And that's a sort of really great way of triaging it and reducing the amount of effort required around it. I've just shared a few insights around credentials with you today. There's actually a white paper around this, which you're very welcome to download. We try and make these fact-based. It's all about what we discover around this area. I do spend a lot of time trying to share our research as much as possible, try and progress the discussion around this. But hopefully you found that useful quick meander through exposed credentials and account takeover. I'm really happy to answer some questions around this as well. So I believe if you point your phone camera at this QR code, it should hopefully populate a Slido and help you ask questions. So I'll leave that up for a minute or so, just whilst I return things back and move into the questions area.
Thank you, James.
Okay, so question one was, do you happen to have age breakdown on the 15 billion creds over time and possibly dump relevancy? It's a really important question, actually. So if you look back to things like the LinkedIn breach, you're going back to like 2007 with stuff like that. And I think that breach was around about 20 or 30 million credentials. By now, pretty much all of those. In fact, if you look at sort of modern web browsers like Google, it actually won't let you set passwords if it was in that breach. It's really interesting to see some of this stuff getting integrated into modern tools that we use today. So it's quite interesting. It did kind of go up quite quickly over the last sort of 12 months or so. So we when we first started this work, and others did too, and I'm sure Troy talks on some of this as well. When it first started out, it was around about the 3 to 4 billion for quite a long time. And then over about the last 8 to 9 months, it's now sort of much higher. As I say, there is a bunch of reuse there, so the real numbers sort of closer to about 6 billion unique creds. I'm afraid I don't have a breakdown here. I've got the white paper here. I'm not sure they included that in the data, but it's a really interesting question, and certainly one we can take a look at for you offline. So I'll see if I can come back with something on that. The second question that was asked was, are bank credentials for sale not stale, i.e. live and can be used straight away? That's a really great question. So one of the really interesting things, of course, one of the things that people don't want to do is waste their time when they're trying to break into somewhere. And just as we've seen on the auto vending carts for credit card data, there's quite a lot of effort put into reputation of sellers. And particularly, you'll see the things, words like fresh used alongside the offer of sale of credentials online. And the freshness of the credentials is part of the selling point. So in particular, there's now, you see vendors sort of putting quite a lot of effort into proving that they're not just going to head off with your money. Secondly, a lot of these sites now have an escrow service. So this enables a money to be held in escrow by the site administrator, and then for buyers and sellers to, the vendor sells the item, the buyer says, yep, that actually works as expected, and then the money only moves once the buyer is satisfied. And for this reason, it's created sort of extreme trust amongst extremely untrustworthy people. And I think that's part of the lifeblood of these sites and how they remain effective. So, making sure that things work and are what they say they are as advertised are often, especially when it comes to things like, because the monetary value of a login, I can charge $90 for a bank login because it's designed to work. Banking is quite interesting in particular, though, because banks are probably the most advanced of any industry in stopping just simple username and password pairs from being effective. It's got to contain other information as well. So either that other information has been harvested and included in, say, a fingerprint that can be used with that account, or there's some methodology to allow either bypassing of the second factor, such as an SMS, maybe that's smishing, or some other technique you'd employ alongside the username and password. So it's really interesting to see a lot of effort is to put into sort of making sure it's clear to the buyer what they're buying and the level of risk they're taking in doing it. Of course, it would be really bad for anybody to do any of this because it'd be completely against the law, but it's an amazing amount of ingenuity that's put into that. Do I have any password? Sorry, go ahead, Gabe.
I was going to say, I think I can start reading them out if that works, and
go for it.
Not, I'll check the audio stream right after. Do you have any password reuse stats across corporate and personal accounts? And what I'm not sure, but I know the question asker a bit, so I suspect he's interested in, by specifying that, is not just password reuse stats, but are they stats different for corporate versus personal accounts?
That's a really good question. I'm afraid I don't. Part of the issue with being able to provide that is to correlate the corporate account with a personal account. I might be JC1526 on gmail.com, but I'm James.Chappell at digitalshadows.com. So trying to marry those two up has proven a bit tricky. I think it's an interesting question, though. I'm wondering whether we can find them bundled for sale and maybe look at them that way. I'm going to take a few of these questions away if you don't mind, Gabe. There's some useful questions being asked, but I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you on that one.
Absolutely, no. It's always a good opportunity for learning. So the other interesting one, and field this as you wish, but what's your biggest complementary security technology? As in, what complements what you do the most?
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting. Gosh, there's a few different ways of looking at that. So I guess there's two. So if you're talking about Digital Shadows Searchlight, then for us, we work really well with managed services that manage what's going on inside a network. We're giving the perspective of what's going on outside the network. But it's very much the case that we try and be part of a operational team that are defending an organization. And I really think that external perspective is so important now. So yeah, I think probably working with managed services that look at the inside of the network is probably the most complementary. I think the other side of what we do is probably on the threat hunting and threat landscape. So we work quite well with sort of the more indicator-based approaches. So there's things called threat intelligence provider platforms, and we also do a lot of partnering with them. That's worked quite well for us over the past because you've got a digital footprint of the organisation, and you've got the sort of telemetry that you get from different behaviours on the internet. That's another quite complementary area that we work into.
Excellent. Mentioning cryptocurrency, this is actually the third time crypto's come up today. The first time was on discussing a potential Hackers remake, and I believe it was Leslie Carhart who said that if you remade Hackers today, instead of the zeitgeist of hacker culture, you'd get cryptocurrency and ransomware, so maybe not remake it in 2020. But is there, presumably, it's around the favorite payments in question. So presumably most payments are being requested in Bitcoin, and questioning about if you're seeing trends and if there's a favorite cryptocurrency.
Actually, interestingly, we see a lot of things like web money being asked for, which are not, they're more sort of remittance, but online remittance. We do still see a lot happening in Bitcoin. We see the regulation of Bitcoin is really upped recently. It's a lot harder for people to move money around in it. We do work with organizations to track Ethereum, Ripple, and others. We see a lot of tumbling services on Ethereum, Ripple, and sort of general BTC as well. It's interesting. It's not just cryptocurrencies. It's a lot of the online remittance services where there's very poor controls in place are actually very attractive for laundering money. And that we'll probably see more of that than we do of crypto in sort of the larger end. When you're paying ransoms, though, it's crypto all the way, and there's a lot of effort put into making sure that's not traceable. And as we know, sort of some not all Tumblr services were created, or Mixer services were created equal. Some are effective and some are less effective, which as defenders, that's a good thing, because it gives us a chance to validate whether or not a lot of payments have been received by that particular address. But we also have the ability to sometimes trace beyond a couple of tumbles of where that Bitcoin has gone. So it actually can produce some quite useful forensic data too. So we'd encourage people to use cryptocurrencies, because as defenders, it gives us some useful clues.
Can you give an example of some of the online remittance services you're speaking of?
So the big one that we see is web money. There's a couple of others. I'd probably have to go and just check with my colleagues on the ones that they see most frequently, but I'll come back to you on that if that's all right.
Not a problem. Okay, so for any tuned in to the stream and for all here, we're going to wrap up the first formal presentation, and I'll be shortly turning off audio and stream until we pick up the second presentation for a private networking session. This session will run approximately 20 or so minutes, and then we'll be coming back for Daley. I'm not going to pronounce your last name, I'm sorry, after hearing that I mangled James's, but talking on Zero Trust, and particularly within the Microsoft stack, how we can apply some things in his learnings in that area as a more recent entrance to the field and more recent ISSA member. So let's go to a break, quick refreshment. Once we go to break, I'll explain more to the Zoom call, and we'll see the stream back in 20 or so minutes.
Okay. Evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Daley Oludapo, and I'm a cloud security operations consultant, and I work for Tiberium, which are an outcome-based cybersecurity company. I'm here to talk to you about Zero Trust, and at the end of my presentation, I will show you a demo using Microsoft Endpoint Protection Manager, formerly called Intune. A lot of the features I'm going to show you most likely have access to if you have an E3 or an E5 license. So let me go ahead and show you. Next slide. What is Zero Trust? Zero Trust helps you secure corporate resources by eliminating unknown, unmanaged devices and limiting lateral movement. So the ethos is never trust, always verify. So why Zero Trust? Why is everyone talking about it at the moment? Well, fundamentally, one of the biggest problems at the moment is people working from home. So could be due to mostly because of the global pandemic. Because of this, firewalls can't protect every endpoint device. VPN traffics are overwhelmed, and more and more applications are going online. So this is why Zero Trust is becoming more important. Why is it so important? Based on one popular threat model, Stride, spoofing is simply authentication. Then we have tampering, making sure data hasn't been touched unlawfully. Repudiation or non-repudiation, so it provides the proof of the integrity of the origin of the data. Information disclosure, so making sure data is confidential to avoid any whistleblowing. DDoS, denial of service, and one of the most important, evaluation of privileges. So as James Chappell mentioned earlier, especially if you're in the food and beverage industry, that this is more likely to be very important. The road to Zero Trust. Planning. So there are many tools out on the market. Popular ones are like Jamf, which is especially and very good with Apple devices. Mobile Lion, which is another big competitor, which do all your endpoints. And Endpoint Protection Manager, which is Microsoft's version, which is formerly called Intune. Implementing. One of the most important things you do once you've decided which platform to go with is deciding your company strategy. Do you want a company-owned device, a BYOD device, or a mixture of both? And once you've decided that, you can create what we call a conditional access, which is the same between Mobile Iron, Jamf, and Endpoint Protection Manager. Ways that you can monitor this is using popular SIEM platforms like Azure Sentinel. If you don't have a SIEM, you can use other native applications like Mobile Iron Threat Defense or Microsoft Defender for Endpoints. Now let me show you how this is done using the Microsoft Endpoint Protection Manager. So if you go into Microsoft 365,
Daley, you need to switch your screens.
it says I'm sharing my screen. Can you not see my admin center?
We cannot.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So if you go into Microsoft 365 Admin Center, look at Show All, and then look for Endpoint Protection Manager. So if you click on Devices and look at a Conditional Access. So a conditional access is effectively the gate. So before any device is approved or allowed to access any corporate data, it will go through a conditional access. So a conditional access I've created earlier is this one here. So the conditional access and what it's supposed to do, it's specifically asking for which user this conditional access is being applied to, what application I want this conditional access to apply to, conditions, type of conditions you can use if you have an E3 or an E5 license. Some of these conditions are related to an E5 license. So a user risk, you can have low, medium, or high. Microsoft don't tell you exactly what those are because they change on a daily basis, but you could decide if you access, for example, a HR application and you want it to be high, you can set that as high, or if you want to just your email to Microsoft 365, you can set them as medium, but they're different for each organization. And then in the conditional access, if you see at the right here, you can choose, make sure it's asking for MFA, and it's asking for the device to be compliant. So what this basically means is once this box is ticked and it's hit it, it would then ask that device to go through Endpoint Protection Manager, which I will now show you. So if we go click on devices and look at compliance policies. So once your conditional access has been set, it will take you to this area here. So this is where you would create some policies. So most of the common ones is iOS, Windows, and Android. So I'm briefly going to show you iOS. So if you click on properties and look at some of the compliance status. So a common one I have is the minimum iOS version. So if it doesn't hit iOS 13, you won't be able to access company data, and you can set it there, have an alert, just tell you, please upgrade your version, or down might block, but you can go through and change all these settings. And you can decide if you require a simple password, the minimal password length, how long it is to check, but each company will be different. So once you set a compliancy policy, you can look at configuration profiles, which is the cloud version of group policy. So here you can set if you want what type of updates are going to be applied, when they're going to be applied. So you can create those policies here. So for example, I've created a Windows update policy to apply to all users and turn off some other settings. Another feature that you can access is Windows Uptime Rings, which is just managing Windows updates. So in here, you can create a profile which pushes updates to Windows clients. You can use the Windows 10 features update. So you can put that only a certain minimal version of Windows has to be applied before your device becomes compliant. Here is where you can implement all those settings. And if you go to apps and go to app protection policy, and once again, by which modality, so Android, iOS, or Windows, I've just done iOS and Android here. So if I click on properties, here I'm targeting all my Microsoft applications because this is where all my company corporate data relies. And then I decide what I want for my data protection. So quite common ones I have in here will be blocking any data for going into iTunes and iCloud. Simply click block. I've got a policy here which says I can only copy and paste from Outlook to other Microsoft managed apps. So for example, if a client decides he wants to copy and paste data from his iOS client and put it into his native email, it will block him from doing it. Cut and paste, blocking third party. And one of the most important one is encrypting organizational data. Make sure that's required. I've done the same creating for Android as well. And another good thing with using Endpoint Protection Manager, if you go into all apps, you can publish certain apps. So for example, if you've got a line of business application that you only want people with fully enrolled devices, you can add that in here. And then what you can do, look at one of the examples, you can assign it to only enrolled devices. For example, here is all users. So that's a way that you can manage a zero trust policy on applications. So once you've gone there, you can go back to devices and you can look at your device overall status. So here you can see the amount of devices you have enrolled. You can see your enrollment, compliancy status, which ones are not compliant, and you could go through and mitigate and check what's gone wrong there. And configuration status, so you can give up more of a report. So this is on the device. But another thing which is quite useful, if you go back into apps, and you click on monitor, app protection status, you have a nice little dashboard and graph so you can show whoever your boss is, okay, we've got 20 users trying to access corporate data, 10 of them are being managed, 11 of them haven't, so you can see what's been flagged. You can download reports and you can just easily, in a nice pane of glass, see how you manage all of these. Thank you very much for listening. And can I take any questions?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Daley. Don't stop sharing. I don't think any questions came in on Slido. Wait, we got some in actually. I just hadn't looked over them recently enough. So the first question in is, can you harden your endpoints in line with security standards such as CIS, or is there a baseline you can use?
There is a baseline. I can show you a quick demonstration. Give me 2 seconds. So if you go into endpoint security, there's an option here saying security baselines. And what Microsoft does, it publishes baselines for you. So one was published here in August 2020. So you would go through and have a look. Let's look at some of these settings. There are multiple settings and you can decide if it's relevant to you or not, or what you would like to change. So for example, I don't know, firewall. These are what Microsoft have recommended, but you might not want to, so you can change it back and cancel it. I hope that answers your question.
I'm sure they can answer if not, but certainly it goes in that way. Do you know if those baselines, do they come from a specific standard, I think, probably is the other half of that question, or are they based on an internal Microsoft thing?
I think it's an internal Microsoft thing, but I'd have to double check.
Okay. Right, the next question is near and dear to, I hope, every single person on this call's heart. And I'm so happy that right now I don't have to deal with it. What are some of the challenges you face when you're trying to get a technology like this conditional access control into a place with a lot of legacy systems?
Yeah, so it can be very challenging from past experience. So if that's the case, what I would probably do is maybe the most important applications and work your way down from there, because whatever you're going to do, you're going to cause some type of pushback. And I know Microsoft has recently set up a new area with authentication headers where you can apply MFA and conditional access to legacy applications, but that was announced in Ignite, so I don't have a lot of information on it. But every day in Microsoft things change, so things were a lot more difficult when I first looked at it. But when I last looked at it in the last couple of days or so, it looks a little bit easier, if I'm totally honest. But without testing it, I can't give a good enough answer.
Okay. Well, frankly, I would argue we have to test any such new technology coming out of a cloud provider nowadays. I have had numerous experiences of major cloud products from top 3 vendors who don't quite match the writing on the tin, or where they didn't bother documenting it.
Yes. Documentation is very difficult sometimes.
So the next one, I'm going to try to do you justice, your question asker, whoever you are. And I think I know where you're coming from. But in essence, the question is around zero trust frameworks today and whether vulnerable to effectively storm tactics that can take advantage of clipping levels and latency thresholds.
Okay, can you repeat the question? I don't know if I quite understood that. Say that again, please, sorry.
The question is, do you feel zero trust frameworks today are vulnerable to storm tactics that take advantage of latency thresholds of solution architectures and related dependencies?
My short answer is yes, but I don't have a good enough long of answer without fully investigating, but I do believe so, yes.
And the final question that was in the stream when I last looked, and the final question is, does this feed into ATP?
Yes. It will feed into they've now rebranded it Microsoft Defender, so you can look at from there. And then for Microsoft Defender, you can use a SIM, which can go into Microsoft Sentinel, so you can monitor all 2 of them.
I'm just transitioning because I would like to, I'm going to be moving out of your slides mode. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Excellent. You can stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
So thank you, Daley, and sorry for the brief delay at the end. That was an excellent question, excellent presentation, and excellent session.
Thank you.
We are now closing out the formal portion of this meeting, so thank you all who have attended and who have stuck around, and also those who are on the stream. Before we do, however, there's a couple of more announcements. One is, as I mentioned, that chapter elections are coming up. I think we still have members of the electoral committee on the call still. I'm just checking. If so, if you would like to speak to this, you can, but it looks like we might have lost some of them. So I will mention that we are now going to be holding our elections very shortly. The process by the process by our bylaws is that the elections have been announced today, but the formal announcement and call for election is going to come out on 5 of October. And we will have the following 30 or 25 odd days for nominations. Nominations are going to be publicized on November 6th. And then we are going to open electronic voting that evening. Then on the 7th of December, we're going to close electronic voting, and we'll announce the results at the chapter meeting that Ryan was talking about earlier. There are 3 officer positions open. The positions that are up for election this year are VP Sponsorship, VP Operations, and I just went through that list the other day. The other hour, but it's been a while. Sponsorship, operations, and I believe it was community, but we will double check. As we all know, the titles and the roles of the team are determined by the acting president and board as a whole. As roles are and people are elected. The process will be announced and managed by an independent elections committee. I am not involved in the process whether or not I choose to run. I do maintain that I am not choosing to run. I will not be entering my own name into the hat this year. However, whether or not I am involved, the process is run independently of us. And both Stuart and Thomas have their own email addresses, but also have the election shared address that I'm still setting up for them. All of that should be in good order, and I hope this works for all on the call. As always, you are welcome to reach out to both the board or to the Elections Committee should there be any concerns. Unfortunately, I think they had to drop. That concludes the formal portion of our meeting. Thank you all, everyone.